but they did not go to Bibbenberg. It took most of the day for them to get deep into Bernicia, and Osrith had a tough time riding her horse at the pace that Uterd wanted to go. The fortress was clearly on the cliff, and Osrith stared at her old home, feeling her hands tense around her reins. But instead of heading east, which clearly was a decision Uterd took a long time to decide, for he slowed and then stopped for some time, they rode on, north. It was darkening when Uterd finally slowed down, and he bade them pull oil-coated cloths over tree branches. "We rest here," Uterd said, "and move north in the morning." And Sihtric and Osferth found as much dry wood as they could to make a fire at the center of their shelters. It began to snow as Osrith was given the job of feeding the rabbit caught by Finan onto stakes to be cooked over 2 crossed frames, and she skinned them deftly as she watched Skade pull her arms about herself, trying to keep warm. Osrith felt sorry for the woman. She saw Finan's point that the seer should not have taken it and Osrith should have challenged her for it. But Osrith was used to the cold, and had more layers than one flimsy dress. When the rabbits were roasting, their enticing scent enveloping the camp, Osrith pulled off her cloak and handed it out to the woman. "Why are you giving this to me?" Skade looked at the cloak suspiciously. "It is merely cloth," Osrith told her in Danish. "It will keep you warm." "And dry," Skade added, and it brought to mind Ulf's identifying Osrith as the sea witch Wokilt, when she had travelled with the Frisian fishing boat from Dunnottar to Hampton. With an air of suspicion still, Skade shot out a thin arm and reached for Osrith's cloak, and she told the seer she was to keep it. "Shouldn't you be watching the conies?" Uterd's voice shouted to Osrith, crossly. "Come away from her," he added, striding over to Osrith and shooing her with his hands towards the fireplace. "Nearly done," Osrith told them, and Uterd said nothing, just nodded at that evening's supper. "And when they are, you are on guard duty," Uterd said to her. "All night?" "All night," Uterd confirmed, and scowled at Osrith as she withdrew Buey. Osrith made out that she had withdrawn her blade so close to him accidentally, but in actual fact she wanted to make sure that her brother knew she was as much of a warrior as any of them. It had been a while since Osrith had done a whole night duty, but she was used to them. It was the beyond midnight hours which were the hardest, as Venus dropped to the other side of the sky, and before dawn. At least she would be warm enough pacing around the camp. "I can guard too," Canute offered. Osrith shrugged as the Dane looked intently at Uterd. "In fact, I will place you with Sihtric and Finan can guard with you, Canute." Uterd's changed plans caused all of his men to listen, and Osrith saw Osferth's face fall. "Are you saying I am not to be trusted with a Dane, Uterd of Bibbenberg?" Osrith asked. "That I may skewer this poor man as he stands beside me to watch for the enemy?" And Uterd had shaken his head at Osrith's challenge to him, but could do nothing much about it. Then, at least, Osrith should have known he was adding up all of her insults to him until another point in the future. In the end, it was decided that Osrith would watch until the skinny moon was above and Finan would change position. Whatever Uterd wanted, it was clear he needed his men to be fit and ready, and Osrith laid more wood on the fire before wandering away from the camp and looked at the stars, as the men behind her laughed and joked, their raucousness filling their little glade where they were camped. One thing was certain, whoever Uterd was planning to meet, it did not matter if he were indiscreet. As the joking and laughter ebbed away into the night and the men took to their shelters, Osrith began to wonder whether she was doing the right thing. They were close to Pitland now, close to the border of Alba. Only a few miles north and they would be in Domhnall's territory, and Osrith felt she could not guess what would happen when she finally stood before her king again. Yes, she thought. Her king. Alfred may have thought that he had prior claim to her oath, but in fact, of course, it had been King, and then King Domhnall. Alba was where her heart lay, and she was prepared to stand before her king and ask for her position back. In perpetuity, if necessary. A crack of a twig behind her caused Osrith to start, and she withdrew away from her scabbard, and turned. "Some assassin you'd make." Osrith hissed loudly when she saw Finan before her, who stood beside her and, too, contemplated the starfield around them as Osrith's stomach lurched at the word assassin. Another reason to go, to be gone from the Lady Ethelflaed. "You'd have been dead long before now," Finan replied. It is not yet time for you to be on duty, Osrith pointed out. Finan smiled at her. I thought you could do with some company. Utad is sleeping, as are the rest of them. And I have to admit, Canute's snoring is pissing me off. He came closer to her, and rubbed his hand across her shoulder as Osrith laughed. That was kind of you, to give that witch your cloak. Your lord needs her alive for some reason, Osrith replied, though kindness had been her uppermost concern, and I didn't like to see her cold. She's a bloodthirsty devil, Finan scoffed. Who cares? I do, Osrith replied, because someone cared for me when I was a pariah. She looked Finan's face, thinking of Sainid, who had spoken her cause to King Devalba, and he dared to reach for her hand. Osrith let him, and he stopped as he found his coin within her fist. Osrith dropped it into his hand. I am nearly in Alba, Osrith told him, and I plan to find my home. She turned to look at Finan. Thami Gaelish. Thamu Alba. I know, Finan replied, and reached with his other hand to her hair. And then he drew Osrith to him, his body warm and cozy against the stark chill of autumn, and she pushed herself up in tiptoe and kissed him. Thajalagam, Osrith began, and broke off when Finan placed a finger to her lips. Don't. Finan then stepped away from her. Don't say it, Osrith. But he did not move away from her, and they stood next to one another until dawn, Osrith not leaving his side until a sharp call from Utad broke them apart in the morning. Get over here. Utad shouted to her, as they prepared to leave. The horses need fetching. As she passed him, Utad hissed, I will be pleased to be rid of you this day. Osrith turned her head to him, the relentless, background feeling of guilt because of Gisela receding even more at his harsh words. Never to see you again will be too soon, she replied, and Utad stamped towards her, growling as Osrith went to the horses. It was around midday when, after traveling further north, Osrith noticed a group of people coming towards them. Around midday, for the day was light but a mist had begun to close in around them. They had ridden into a valley, and at the other end horses carrying riders were waiting there to meet them. It could only be one person, Osrith realized, when they neared, and definitions and features of the riders became more apparent. For leading the band, long black hair, pale eyes with a circlet of gold and a rich blue cape, was her king. Domnall. Utad raised a hand, which stopped all of the horses at the end of the valley. It looked to be that the king of Alba had brought about a dozen men. At first, Osrith could not make them all out clearly, but then her heart began to beat faster, her skin prickled, as she saw people of Alba, Gales, people she loved. Domnall too had stopped the procession, and was as if 8 years had not passed. Her heart began to beat faster when she saw that. Next to him was Domnall, and on his right flank the man who had helped her flee Darnotta. Sainid looked no older than she remembered him, perhaps a little lighter around the ears. But his grey eyes were as bright as ever she remembered, lithe as if ready to spring to the defence of his king, and held on to her reins as tight as ever she could to prevent her from fleeing her black mare and tearing over to them, to her family. Sense cautioned her. Were these not the people, Domnall and Constantine specifically, who had traded her to Guthard? Yet, that was a long time ago when she had fled. She had to stay level-headed. But the man was not Domnall, but Constantine. How different he looks, deeper set in his looks, long dark hair, more intense blue eyes, his face sharper. Where there might have been a circlet of gold, his hair had been combed in such a fashion. A clever ruse, to protect Domnall, to come to a meeting of the enemy and not. Osrith bit the inside of her mouth for a moment to bring herself to her senses. She could so easily run to him, stand beside him, be another warrior with the men of Alba, as she always had been. But Utad was now bringing his horse close to Constantine, and the prince had straightened up in his mount. Osrith could not hear what was being said, but it was clear a careful exchange of words were being calmly conveyed. Then, just as Osrith thought she could stand it no longer, it was Finan who broke the spell. He approached Utad at her brother's beckon, and took the rein of the boy who Osrith now realized must have been behind them. Please greet the Lord Utad, Selach, Constantine encouraged. Good morning, Lord, Selach said, earnestly, and Osrith had to look twice at the boy, for he was the image of Mary, thick, blonde hair that turned in gentle waves, mid-blue eyes like the northern sea around Irian. Then, into Constantine's hands Uhtred placed a bag, and not a small one, containing what Osrith could only assume was silver before Finan led Selach from his family, the boy casting a sad look towards his father. But not before Osrith noticed both Constantine and Domnall look at Finan as if they knew him. "A fine exchange," Uhtred declared. "Our hostage," he added. Hostages were common amongst noble families, and as such were usually given an excellent education by their host family and only rarely being put to death. "Our hostage," Uhtred continued, as Selach began to ride between him and Finan as they turned and headed south, in exchange for an agreement to begin a war on Bibbenburg. So that was it, Osrith thought, grimly. Money had changed hands and Constantine was going to harry Bibbenburg on Uhtred's behalf, to reduce their uncle's men and deplete his resources. Uhtred had no need to go to Bibbenburg if the Scots could do it for him. Being at the back was an advantage, Osrith thought, as the party rode on. Not even Osferth said anything when Osrith lingered back for a minute and turned to watch Constantine and his men retreat north into the mist. And then a sudden thought struck her. If Uhtred had struck a bargain, and Constantine had agreed to attack Bibbenburg on his behalf, that implied no prior arrangement had been reached with Elfric and Osrith could come with them. She pulled her horse up sharply, which rejected Osrith's treatment of it by stamping its 4 feet. Osrith patted her neck and whispered low to its ear, because she had to say it aloud, she was going to Alba. Only, she was not. After 100 yards following Constantine, Osrith slowed down to a juddering stop as the urgent message her brain was trying to get across to her finally penetrated her mind. Elfric did not matter. That she was married, on paper, to Guthard, meant that her alliance with Cumbraland still stood. Domnall would still control that land and therefore control his cousin, Dyfnwil, as well as have a greater influence over Bibbenburg. She galloped back to the rear of the group, and inhaled sharply when she realized Finan had been watching Osrith all that time. In her hand, Osrith still had her silver coin. Osrith slept beside Finan that night, as Sihtric and Uhtred kept watch. She had made herself a place to sleep in the lee of 2 rocks that kept most of the wind away and felt her heart melt as she felt the body of her lover press next to her. "You did not go," Finan noticed, as he trailed his arms around her, bringing her close to him, feeling the satisfying sensation of Finan pressing his interest beside her leg. "I could not," Osrith replied. "As I rode to the border, as I crossed it, I knew I did not belong there. Mercia is my home, my land." She stopped, and they both held one another before Osrith spoke again. "Uhtred has not given up Bibbenburg. It is a very good strategy to let the Scots weaken it for him." "Will ye wait for me in Mercia, then?" Finan asked, pulling away from her as the leaves rustled about him. Damn Uhtred. He had clearly warned Finan from being with her. And yet, here he was. Osrith got up too, pressing his silver piece in her hand before turning to him and pressing her lips to his. 88,888,888. As they approached Dunham from the north later the next day, their party still together with a hostage in tow, another party approached from the south. From her position at the back, Osrith could see that there was no more than 3 riders, then was astonished to discover that it was Thara and Father Bicker, with a guard. They were welcomed at the gate and in the hall, and Ragnar, on asking the priest his business, laughed heartily when Bicker announced that Uhtred had a formal banishment from Wessex. "He is a Dane now," Ragnar declared, and clapped Uhtred on the back. It was only when Bicker had come out of the hall so his wife and her brother could speak that he noticed Osrith, who was at pains to keep out of his way. "Edra?" Her old name betrayed Osrith, and she turned, saddle in hand, and looked at her former priest. Bicker simply stood before her, and it was enough for Osrith to put down the saddle onto a hay bale and stride towards him. She was determined, though, not to give in to any soft talk about going with them to Wessex, for that was where Bicker had told Ragnar they were returning to the next day. But it seemed that the priest's main concern was for her safety, and he embraced her briefly, and told her it was good to see her in the company of her brother. "Thank you for your concern for me, Father Bicker," Osrith replied, when he began to walk with her around the stable yard, and made sure she declined his offer before he had even made it. I worry you have no life, no strength, wandering around places like this, Bilka confided in Osrith. But she shook her head. My life is good, I can fight. And Prince Edward? It was an open question, and Osrith fell into the trap. I have done wrong by lying with the Etheling, she admitted, and saw a muscle twitch in his face. He had meant that she had left, but Bilka knew as well as anyone that her agreement had been to guard Edward until his marriage to Elflad. Now, he had got Osrith to admit to her indiscretions. And why are you here? Bilka asked, plainly, when they had reached the kitchens. Osrith looked across to Utad, beside him, Finan. Your brother? A smile graced the priest's face. You want to be by your brother? But Osrith folded her arms. I hate him. She shot back, then conceded, but I find I have more ties with him and Wessex than in Pitland. I was travelling north, we went right to the border of Alba, the current border, Osrith added, for Bilka was of Melrose and knew better than anyone the transient nature of kingdom borders in that part of the world. The royal family came to it. But I could not go. Then you should leave here, go north, go south, anywhere that is not here. Bilka insisted, loudly. What is coming here, Edra? You do not want to be involved in. Then he stepped towards her and pulled her to him, like he had when she was a child. You are most precious, please make your choices wisely. But it was Osrith's talk to Thyra that afternoon that stuck with her for a long time. Perhaps, in hindsight, an older Osrith thought, because of her violent death she had searched her mind for the times when she had spoken to the Danish woman. You are so happy, Osrith told her, as they walked in the stableyard, too. I haven't always been so, Thyra replied in her light, stilted English. After Sven, I did not know I was alive all these years. She turned to look upon her husband and Osrith followed her gaze. Bilka allowed me to live. He tells me that many great saints have come from Northumbria. You are a Christian? Thyra nodded. And you? Yes, Osrith replied, though I have spent a long time away in Alba, she added, laconically. They have a different Christianity and I have found it has been hard to re-establish my Anglish faith. Then, do not give up, Thyra implored, taking Osrith's hands in her own, delicate ones. They were cold, and Osrith buried them in her own to warm them for her. Whatever route you must take, you should never stop trying. Then, she pulled away from Osrith and looked up. The sky was brightening, and it was making to be a cold afternoon in the weak sun. The saints are like the gods, she mused, half to herself, like, they are next to the Allfather, God. Osrith thought of those words as she was lying alone beside Finan, though at that time had not noticed the implication of Thyra bringing her hand to her lower stomach as she stood, thinking, before she and Bilka left Dunham. Finan was not himself, Osrith thought, and when she began to kiss him again, to see whether it would lead to a second time. And she wanted that, for she had suspected that she would need to leave Dunham quickly, maybe even as early as that night, and did not know when she would see him again. Here, Osrith said, finding Finan's hand and pressing the silver coin into it. She felt Finan's breath near her shoulder. Keep it, he murmured, folding her hand around it, then shuffled in the straw. Offered the silver back, he folded her hand around it. It is dangerous here, Osrith, he cautioned. I have heard talk of. Osrith prompted. A fracture in this army. Utad for one is spoiling to challenge Sigurd Bloodheir, Ragnar is hosting that Scottish bastard's offspring for him for an alliance. He sighed into her hair. I would have you go quickly, tonight if ye can, Osrith, if ye plan to. Finan reached to hold her tightly and Osrith yielded to what would be their place together in one another's arms. All the protection that you once had under Ragnar is now gone. What? Osrith sat up, her breasts brushing Finan's chest as she did so. From below, a voice called, for Finan to join him. Her brother. Osrith felt a rise of anger. You have declared yourself to be a Mson, and as such, an enemy to Ragnar and his army, he explained, and then exclaimed, Oh God, Osrith, did ye not know? Osrith scrambled to her feet, dressing as best as she could in the darkness, before turning to find Finan, kiss his lips once more. "Go," he insisted. "Take whatever you can. I asked you before, but you did not answer Osrith," he broke off, and then added, as if debating whether to ask the next question, "Will you wait for me in Mercia?" Osrith took Finan's face in her hands, and kissed him firmly. "I will."